Professor Howard Gardner from the Harvard Graduate School of Education is my guest here on Reconnect today. Thank you very much for staying there with us as we go back to that discussion that we're having with him. Professor Gardner, you know, child-related education, some of it, sometimes we find that it's going out of the window. Do you agree with that?
By child-related, you mean what?
I mean actually education where children will enjoy, you know, being, you know, in a classroom and studying it, and they're being, you know, allowed to do what you're saying, you know, where a child can actually focus on what they're good at. Is that, you know, do you get a sense of that sometimes?
I think that all over the world there's a recognition that education is very important and that a country's fate is tied integrally to how educated the population is. But I would agree with the implication of your question that often it results in a distortion of what people who study children feel are the best ways to develop the mind. I would say that it's the Ministry of Education view everywhere that the most important thing is to improve the country's performance in certain kinds of tests.
Yes.
What I quip is France would rather be 23 if Germany is 24 than number 2 if Germany is number 1.
Yes.
I have nothing against there being international comparisons, but when they drive all of education, it becomes pernicious. And that's because certain tests become very important. People then teach to the test. Things which aren't on the test get pushed aside. In the United States, arts get pushed aside.
Right.
Humanities gets pushed aside. Even history and science get pushed aside as reading and math become the sole way in which people are assessed. Moreover, the proper way to assess is to teach people things so that you can show what they know in a variety of different ways. What often happens now is people are trained sort of like a seal or like a dog to do well in a certain kind of test, but if you approach things in other ways, they're clueless about what they do. So yeah, I think that there is a distortion. What I would talk about is both developmentally appropriate education, which means that you don't just look at a person's age, but you actually look at their level of understanding, their competence, and you try to teach them at that level. But also, as your question implies, childhood is a wonderful period of life.
Absolutely.
It's way extended in human beings as compared to any other species, and that's because we can learn so much through exploring, through raising our own questions, through wandering in unfamiliar spaces. I often say if I really want to know about a child's intelligences, I spend a day with them at a children's museum, where there are many, many different kinds of things to do, many different kinds of things to play, and I don't sit there and say, you've got to be here for 5 minutes and then here for 5 minutes. I let the child wander. Now, you implied before that we should recognize a child's strengths and encourage the child to do that. That moves from a description to a value judgment. I'm not somebody who says that we should only focus on children's areas of strength, but I do say we should know what they are. And often those areas of strength can actually provide an avenue into areas where people aren't so strong, because maybe you do need to cover the full spectrum of intelligences, but you don't have to do it in a clumsy and ham-handed way.
Right. Talking about that, what about assessment? I mean, what do you think about this? In many of our schools, you know, in India, we have this, you know, yearly tests and yearly exams, etc. And sometimes very, very hard on children.
Well, I make a very sharp distinction between testing and assessment. So let me tell you.
Please.
For me, a test is something imposed by an external body. It's given at a certain time. It's often short answers, maybe multiple choice, maybe short essays. It's then sent somewhere else, and sometime later you get your score. Incidentally, that's also been true about IQ testing. We've tested people's IQs for 100 years. We give them a score, but then we don't know what to do with it. The score says you're smart or you're dumb, and it's put on your forehead, and that's it. Assessment is very different. Assessment means that both the person who's the educator and the person who's being educated has a sense of what they're learning, but the assessment tells you, are they learning well? If not, what are the problems? And if so, what should we do the next day or the next week or the next month to correct that sort of thing? And I think assessment should be part of every human being's existence from early in life. But it should be what we call formative. It should be immediate feedback. It should be cooperative. Let's say our interview wasn't going very well.
Right.
And you said, let's do it over again. One of the things you would do would be to say to me, when the television was off, well, you weren't focusing exactly on my question, or you weren't looking at my eyes. And I would then say to you, well, I couldn't tell where you were looking, and I didn't actually understand your question. That would be a useful kind of assessment, presumably, because when we turned the cameras on again, it would work better. But what good would it do to me if we had the interview and there was somebody sitting there scoring it, and 6 months later when I was back in the United States and you'd forgotten what I was, said, oh, your score was B-. It would be of no use. So that's the difference between testing and assessment. And any skilled professional, anybody who gains expertise, is assessing all the time, but you do it almost in an unconscious way.
That's right, not even thinking about it, right? You have many interests as well. I know that you have an abiding interest in the arts too.
Yeah.
I want to draw you out.
Well, autobiographically, when I was young, I was a serious pianist.
I know, I believe.
Yeah.
Do you still get to playing a little bit now and then?
Right, but not for public consumption.
Right, okay.
And then when I went to university, and particularly when I did post-university work in England in the 1960s, I became involved in a number of different arts, mostly as a connoisseur, as an observer. And I began to work in 1967 at a group called Project Zero at Harvard, whose focus has always been on learning in the arts. And it's now 45 years old, and one of the things I'm proudest of, that we're still a major center of artistic learning. And in recent years, I've begun to serve on the boards of organizations. I'm on the board of an orchestra in Boston. I'm on the board of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which is a major institution. And then I do my little bit to both make sure that these institutions think about education, and at the same time I learn something about the arts today. In fact, my most recent book, which is called Truth, Beauty, and Goodness Reframed, began as a set of 3 lectures, which I gave a few years ago at the Museum of Modern Art, and because those lectures engendered a lot of attention and interest, I made a book out of it.
Right. You were also in China quite a lot. You've spent a lot of time there, and one of your very good books came out of China.
Well, it's nice of you to say it was a good book.
25 books, I mean, over all these years. Tell me about your experience there.
Well, I first went to China in 1980 as the first delegation from Harvard to go to China. And China at that time was just coming out of the Cultural Revolution. And to put it bluntly, the country was in shell shock because it was one of the most brutal eras of modern history. And I just went there with the delegation, knowing nothing and just learning something about China. Then 2 years later, I was invited to go to China again as a delegation to study arts education in China. And I had a lot of interest in arts education, so I was more prepared for that. The day before the group went to China, the head of the delegation got sick. And because I had only been American who'd been to China before, I became the head of a delegation. Now in China at that time was supposed to be a communist society, very flat. That was, of course, total nonsense. It was completely hierarchical. And I was the head of the delegation, so all the attention focused on me. I got the royal treatment. And I then began a research project which brought me back to China a number of times to look at education in the visual arts and in music. And I went the last time with my wife Ellen, who's an expert in the arts. And so we did a lot of studying of how arts are done in China. It's very, very interesting. One of the advantages of studying arts in China, particularly with young children, is that if you don't know the language, it's not a big handicap, because music and visual arts are not,
absolutely,
I could not have studied theater or poetry. And so yes, I did write a book about this. And since then I've had many Chinese students. Chinese students both tend to venerate the professors, which is very nice. But also my interest
in India as well. We do that, yes.
My 2-day experience confirms that. But also because of my interest in the arts, that's been a very natural kind of intercourse with them. And while I don't collect art, I'm a professor, so I don't have the means to do that, I always take advantage of my opportunities to visit art, whether it's in China or India or any other country.
Professor Gardner, time for another very short break, but we'll get right back with you here on Reconnect. Please don't go anywhere.